Ever since I was young, I've always been enamored by handheld gaming, what with my very first console being the Game Boy Advance. No more were the days of being restricted to a TV and only when nobody else was using it. Now you could take your Marios and Kirbys wherever you went, from the bedroom to the airplane. Not to mention, aside from all the practicalities of the concept, the price tag was a whole lot less scarier than its home console counterparts, leading to many opting for a handheld due to that fact alone. And while companies would try to tap into the lucrative handheld market by putting out consoles of their own, each with a slight variation to make it stand out, none would ever be more successful than the conquest of the Nintendo DS. Hello everyone, this is the RPG Monger, and today let's talk about the incredible legacy of the DS and 3DS family of systems. In the early 2000s, Nintendo was in a sticky situation. Having eliminated one longtime rival and received two in its place, the competition between companies was stronger than ever. Let me explain. Unlike the 90s where Nintendo had always come out on top, beating Sega time and time again with each new console, the tables had turned. Starting with the 5th console generation, Sony would join the fray and release the PlayStation 1, outselling Nintendo's N64 by a long shot. And the PS1 wouldn't just be a fluke, as in the next generation, Nintendo's foothold in the home console market would be lost entirely, what with the GameCube's release being microscopic compared to the PS2's monumental sales, even doing worse than the N64. Not to mention, now there'd be a new competitor in the mix with Microsoft's Xbox, a console that wouldn't see success on the level of the PS2, but still beat the GameCube by a bit. However, unlike Sega before it, Nintendo still had one last trump card in its ever-shrinking deck, the handheld. Since throughout the years, as a variety of companies tried to dethrone it, Nintendo had never lost its foothold in the handheld market, with the recent Game Boy Advance still doing pretty well, all things considered. In turn, starting in 2002, Nintendo would begin to develop what started as a new entry in the Game Boy line of systems, a console that either make or break the company. Though while this mysterious 5th Game Boy was developed, something unusual happened. The then newest president of Nintendo, Satoru Iwata, would receive a bizarre request from his predecessor, Hiroshi Yamauchi. All the while most people at Nintendo were on board with this Game Boy Advance successor, Yamauchi insisted that the handheld have 2 screens instead of 1, like a few of the original Game & Watches. Hearing that, not only would the entire dev team hate the idea, but even Iwata himself had serious doubts about it. I mean, when you really think about it, the concept was kind of absurd. Like, how could a person pay attention to both screens, and what difference would it make? Questions like these and many more would become commonplace within the dev team, but throughout everyone's doubts, including his own, Iwata would see Yamauchi's vision through and tell the dev team to make it work however they can. In turn, Project Nitro was born, being developed over a span of 2 years to become the Nintendo DS, released in 2004. Sporting 2 screens instead of 1, at least in appearance, the DS was definitely an entirely different beast than the Game Boy Advance. But alongside the most basic differences like its appearance, it'd actually be the strategies used alongside its launch that end up making the DS far different from anything Nintendo had created before. You see, instead of going for the general audience that would always buy their consoles and games, starting with the DS, Nintendo would aim to expand that pool of people using neat features like the touchscreen to appeal to a wider audience. And aside from that, just in general, the DS had a lot of cool innovative features, like wireless local multiplayer, a rudimentary connection to the internet, a built-in microphone, and cool little things like PictoChat, a built-in application where you can message nearby friends who also had it open, or according to certain news outlets, lead to children getting kidnapped?
And remember Marissa chatting with her friend in the other car? That means a molester driving along could see your child in the back seat and start sending messages while you're in the front seat, totally oblivious to what's happening.
Yeah, that definitely checks out. But all of its bells and whistles aside, just from a hardware standpoint, the DS was quite a beast compared to the Game Boy Advance, being able to play games like the Mario 64 remake at launch, something that when I was younger absolutely blew my mind. In every way, shape, and form, the DS had set a new standard for handheld gaming, permanently changing the landscape for the better. Plus, on a side note, when it came to durability, Iwata created the DS with our absolute stupidity in mind, making sure the handheld could survive a fall as much as 1.5 meters 10 times in a row. And honestly, considering we've all dropped our DSs at some point or another, it was a pretty good call. In turn, with all that innovation would come equally monumental sales, permanently saving the company from having to do anything too drastic. Though what with Nintendo initially being very doubtful about whether the DS would succeed or not, they were originally planning for it to exist as a sort of third pillar alongside the Game Boy Advance and and GameCube. This would be seen when Nintendo released the Gameboy Micro in 2005, a new, even smaller Game Boy Advance that, while having some interesting ideas like swappable faceplates, would obviously end up being a flop, what with it removing all backwards compatibility and the DS being able to play Game Boy Advance games as is. However, the actual system aside, what about the DS's competition? Well, Nintendo couldn't have timed its release better, because in 2004, Sony's PlayStation Portable would also be released, a console that, unlike the Game Boy's half-baked competitors, would prove to become Nintendo's first real competitor in the handheld market, packing even more power than the DS. Though even then, the DS would still come out on top, as not only was the DS $100 cheaper than the original PSP, but due to it in general casting a far larger net in hopes to attract people who'd never touched video games, it'd sell way better. So moving forward, as the DS craze swept across the globe, Nintendo would immediately begin working on an upgrade, because as great as the original DS was, it wasn't exactly the sleekest thing in the world, leaving a lot of room for improvement. Thankfully, this would be an easy fix, because in only 2 years after the original version came out, Nintendo would release the DS Lite, a brighter, lighter, slightly cheaper, and overall far more appealing version of the console that'd sell even better than the previous version, making the already successful console that much more powerful. In fact, when I was a kid, this would be the first DS I'd ever get. However, let's step aside here for a bit. While the hardware itself would make up half the reason why the DS was so popular, we still haven't covered the other half: its massive library of games. Much like the DS, the games that were made for it were unlike any ever seen, utilizing the dual screens in an infinite number of ways. From creating games around the concept with stuff like WarioWare Touched and Kirby Canvas Curse, to games that utilize the touchscreen more for convenience with just about all the Pokemon games that went on the DS. Hell, even remakes would end up benefiting from the touchscreen, a personal favorite of mine being Kirby Superstar Ultra, an absolute necessity for the DS if you've never played it. The possibilities truly were endless, and to be fair, this would lead to a lot of half-baked games that kind of existed just to use the touchscreen in gimmicky ways, but many of those would be overshadowed for the most part. Not to mention, aside from the obvious touchscreen, later on, some games would get even more creative, with certain segments requiring you to play the DS on its side, like the giant boss segments in Bowser's Inside Story. Of course, aside from these, the DS would also receive a plethora of solid games that barely use the two screens at all, only delegating minor details to the second screen like a map. But it'd be dynamic things like these that really made the DS shine above the rest. However, that shine wouldn't last, because when it comes to consoles, what was once revolutionary and innovative always becomes bland and commonplace after a couple years, and Nintendo knew this all too well. In turn, not very long after the DS Lite was released in 2006, Nintendo would scrap the idea of a larger DS Lite and direct its focus towards something a bit different. You see, by now, Apple had released the very first iPhone, a device that in no time at all would make touchscreens far more common, inadvertently taking away one of the DS's biggest novelties in tandem. So what with the touchscreen defining the first two DS's in the family, instead of just coming up with one new feature to wow the public, Nintendo would pack in a bunch with the third member of the family, the Nintendo DSi. Being developed at a breakneck pace to meet the 2008 release date, the DSi would go through a pretty interesting development process itself, with its bizarre original design being pretty different from the final product, most notably having 2 game slots rather than one and being far larger in general. As a result, after being met with heavily negative reception within Nintendo, the handheld would have to be completely redesigned, even though it had already entered the final stages of development. All things considered, Nintendo would be pretty lucky the DSi even turned out well at all, what with how bumpy its development was. Though on that note, what would the DSi end up being? Well, like you probably already know or gleaned from a name like DSi, the handheld would sport far more advanced internet capabilities than its predecessors, sharing many characteristics with Nintendo's new smash hit home console, the Wii. For starters, the DSi would be the first handheld Nintendo gave an online shop to, allowing people to buy and download games directly to the handheld. Of course, compared to now, the DSi shop wouldn't really be all that great, what with most of the games on it being generic throwaway titles. But there would be some gems hidden under all the trash, like Cave Story and Shantae Risky's Revenge. Plus, games aside, the DSi shop would also bring neat applications like Flipnote Studio, a program that would go on to develop an entire community within it, etching itself into the childhoods of thousands. Though moving past the DSi shop, the console also featured an internet browser. It wasn't the most advanced thing in the world, but it'd be more of an interesting novelty than anything. However, speaking of novelties, there's one more addition the DSi would get that attract far more people than its internet capabilities. capabilities. The DSi cameras. Placed quite noticeably on the back of the DSi's top screen and hidden away in the middle of the divider, the DSi cameras were definitely a cool addition to the already great handheld. Not having the best quality, but being the very first camera for a lot of kids, myself included. And with the cameras came an SD card slot, able to not only store and transfer pictures taken with the DSi, but even play music already on the card. So once the DSi hit the market, just like Nintendo had planned, it'd completely revive interest in the DS, selling even quicker in its opening months than the DS, DS Lite, and even the Wii. Not to mention, in only a year's time, Nintendo would put out yet another addition to the DS family, the DSi XL, an alternate DSi that, you guessed it, was larger. A handheld that, at least when it comes to me, holds a special place in my heart, what with it boasting a whopping 17-hour battery life and somehow still working perfectly even though I've dropped it onto the hard pavement numerous times. So now, with the DS line of systems becoming a bit old, it'd take Nintendo more than just updating the DS again to retain everyone's attention. It needed a proper successor. Just like the previous handheld consoles, it'd take no time at all after the DSi's release for Nintendo to start shifting its focus towards a new handheld. Though what more could Nintendo do to improve on the DS? Knowing them, just doing something as simple as making the console more powerful wouldn't cut it. They'd need something new, something unique that grabbed the attention of all their demographics. And so, the Nintendo 3DS was born. Still competing with Sony as they'd be developing a new handheld around this time too, the 3DS would end up being an amalgamation of a lot of Nintendo's experiments up until that point, from the obscure Famicom 3D system to the infinitely cursed Virtual Boy. As much like the Virtual Boy, the 3DS would use glasses-free stereoscopic 3D. The only difference was it wouldn't be pressed up against your eyes in monochrome. However, as much as there is to criticize about the Virtual Boy, it would ironically have a singular advantage over the 3DS's 3D, stability. Since what with the 3DS being a handheld, naturally you'd move it around quite a bit while playing, right? Well, normally that's never a problem, but if you happen to be playing with the 3D on while doing this, the 3D lost all of its stability, leading to it only being viable if you played the 3DS in a fixed position, never moving your hands. Now don't get me wrong, when the 3D worked, it worked, and with games like the Ocarina of Time remake and Super Mario 3D Land, there were quite a few segments that benefited a whole lot with the addition of 3D. But beyond that, the 3D was more of a cool novelty than anything, not being the most pleasant feature in the world to constantly use while playing a game. And besides comfort, unless you had the 3DS charging alongside, it would be nearly impossible to play everything in 3D. What with the console's already weak 5-hour battery life when playing 3DS games being reduced to 3 if you had the 3D on. Plus alongside that, what with Nintendo releasing a slew of warnings surrounding the 3D to protect them from potential liability, many consumers would be put off by the system, even though it couldn't be more harmless for anyone above the age of 6. Hell, I remember when I was 11, I almost never had a 3DS at all, due to my parents being skeptical about the 3D. Though enough about that, what else would the 3DS have to offer? Well, as the 3DS ripped everyone's attention off the still recent DSi, it'd also be revealed that the 3DS had even more shiny new features, like the now 2 cameras situated behind the top screen, allowing people to view photos in 3D, another cool novelty. And speaking of novelties, who could forget, or remember, Nintendo's experiment with augmented reality, since coming with each 3DS system came a small set of cards you could use for a built-in app called AR Games, a game that was more of a cool little tech demo to mess around with than anything. And outside of that, similar applications of the feature wouldn't be used very often, ending up as no more than a passing gimmick found in a few games. However, at least with me, the thing that would really steal the show was Streetpass, a new functionality added to the 3DS that would still be a novelty, but a really cool one at that. Basically, how it worked was when you'd walk around places with your 3DS in sleep mode, if you happened to pass by others with a 3DS, the systems would quickly exchange information and you'd see their Miis in the built-in game, Streetpass Mii Plaza, where they would then help you progress in little mini-games. I swear, to this day, Streetpass is probably my favorite thing to ever come out of the 3DS, as not only was filling in puzzles bit by bit really rewarding, but when you'd on and off chance pass by someone traveling, like at an airport, it'd always be really cool seeing how far away they lived. And the plaza aside, for many 3DS games, Streetpass functionalities would be implemented in some way, usually only giving minor things like power-ups, but still making things a bit more unique. Plus, aside from the main features, over the handheld's lifespan, Nintendo would implement a variety of cool experiments that really enhanced the 3DS experience. Just to name one, early on there was Nintendo Video, a free downloadable app that would periodically release videos you could watch in 3D. Unfortunately, its lifespan wouldn't really be very long, but while it existed, it'd host a wide range of content from existing cartoons, movie trailers, that one Kirby Right Back At Ya special we don't talk about, and most importantly,
Dinosaur Office! Roar!
I guarantee that if you had a 3DS early on, this miniseries is most likely burned into your mind, what with how many episodes were put on Nintendo Video. All in all, the 3DS was very much a system of novelties, with all its side features attracting many of the people that end up getting it. Though even with all its cool features, the launch of the 3DS wouldn't be exactly like its predecessors, starting at a whopping $250 at launch. Initially, things were looking pretty great, with the console getting more pre-orders than ever before, though as a result of concerns about the console on top of the hefty price, the 3DS would just miss Nintendo's projections. In response, after only a few months, a third of the price would be slashed off, dropping the 3DS to a far more reasonable $170, reigniting the handheld sales. Though once again, all the characteristics of the 3DS were only half the story. What about its library of games? Well, unlike the DS, the 3DS wouldn't lead to any sort of revolution in the industry, what with its aforementioned features all being more separate from the actual games themselves. Instead, the 3DS would provide a more traditional advantage, with the system having more power than its predecessor, allowing for far more advanced games. And even though in retrospect the original 3DS still wasn't all that powerful, it'd be more than made up for with its fantastic selection of games. Just take entries like Icarus Uprising, Kirby Planet Robobot, and Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon. Even though the console wasn't very strong, they'd each manage to make the most of it, all three still being all-time favorites of mine. Hell, especially with Kid Icarus Uprising, the fact that it looked so good, had so much content, and even had voice acting all the while being a handheld game absolutely blew me away when I first got it. On a side note, if you somehow missed playing Uprising, I'd still highly recommend it today. Even with the fully fleshed out 3DS library now, it's still one of the best. But back on track, once again, Nintendo had succeeded, finally seeing the culmination of all their 3D research come to fruition. Even when Sony released the PlayStation Vita, a successor to the PSP, the 3DS would remain unshaken, though at least that time, the Vita's lukewarm lifespan was kind of Sony's fault too. So now, with the DS family of systems having evolved into the 3DS family of systems, let's take a look at what's to come after the 3DS, because things would get pretty bizarre. Like the DSi, following the 3DS, Nintendo would release the 3DS XL, a handheld that kind of speaks for itself. Not much to mention there aside from a slightly better battery life. What is worth mentioning though is the first real variation the console would get in 2014, the Nintendo 2DS. Now, I know what you're thinking.
Is this an out-of-season April Fool's joke?
But yes, this was and continues to be a thing. Now, on one hand, I can understand why the 2DS exists. After Nintendo sacrificed the youngest section of their market with the inclusion of 3D, even though you could easily disable it with parental controls, the stigma that lingered over the handheld was obviously enough to push them to make what was essentially the same system except without the 3D. Don't get me wrong, there would be benefits to get the system, with it being far cheaper than the 3DS at $130, but come on man, I get that you need to make the console different somehow, what with it being a slightly crappier clone anyways, though did you have to opt out of the iconic clamshell design for the slab? I mean, as a result, the handheld would be stuck with only a singular speaker, which when compared to the usual two, provided a far worse sound quality overall. However, as a counter-argument to that, at the end of the day, it was more intended as an entry-level handheld for Nintendo's youngest market, who would go on to generally enjoy the console. I guess it's just more of a personal preference thing, honestly. The only real downside that came with its inception was even though Nintendo would deny it, later interviews would reveal that some games would end up being altered during development to accommodate the 2DS, like Legend of Zelda Link Between Worlds for example. Plus, as the years went by, later games made for the 3DS line would have limited 3D or no 3D altogether, really showing just how much Nintendo lost interest in the once primary selling point of the system. But moving past that, as the 3DS family kept going strong, it'd only take Nintendo another year to release the newest handheld in the series of consoles, this time actually being an upgrade to the base system, the new Nintendo 3DS, a handheld whose name I originally thought was a joke when it was first announced. However, laughable name aside, this handheld was no joke, honestly being what I and many others expected from the 3DS from the start. Unlike the original 3DS, where the 3D wasn't exactly the best, losing stability a lot of the the time, the new version would feature what Nintendo would call Super Stable 3D, which through a sensor on the system would detect the angle of the player's face, adjusting the 3D accordingly. Finally, the 3DS had actually solid 3D, being far easier to use while playing. Though truth be told, even with the Super Stable 3D, I'd never really use it too often myself. But aside from the actually decent 3D, what would really interest me and many others was the new 3DS's hidden power as a whole, fixing the original's issues with playing larger, more complex games smoothly. In fact, it'd be such a difference from the first 3DS that Nintendo would release 4 games that could only be played on the new variant, most notably being the new 3DS port of Xenoblade Chronicles, a massive RPG that was originally for the Wii. Though as much as this system was arguably the best handheld Nintendo had ever made, it wouldn't be without its little points of weirdness, namely the differences between the normal version and the XL version. You see, much like the now obscure Gameboy Micro, the new 3DS would also have swappable faceplates, adding a cool little layer of customization to the handheld. However, when it came to the extra large edition, Nintendo would flat out omit the feature entirely for no good reason at all. And on top of that, for some reason only in the North American release, the XL edition would be the only version released, with the normal new 3DS coming out quite a few months later. All in all, launch quirks aside, the new 3DS was a fantastic system and an overall good bookend for the 3DS family, as by the time it came out, Nintendo was already looking towards the future, beginning to show signs of phasing out not only the 3DS, but the vastly less successful Wii U as well. Except wait, this is Nintendo we're talking about here. You think they'd just leave a DS without giving it a more refined version? Of course not. And as things would have it, the slab still didn't have a counterpart yet. In turn, only 2 years later, after Nintendo had already released the Nintendo Switch, a hybrid console that could be played like a home console or a handheld, Nintendo would still go ahead and release the new 2DS XL, thankfully returning to the clamshell design instead of chiseling an even larger slab. Though now, here we are in the present day. Stretching across a grand period of 15 years and counting, the DS and its descendants would define the childhoods of thousands, myself included. Hell, even now, with the 2DS line being the last branch of the 3DS not discontinued, the DS is still impacting the kids of today. But just like the Game Boy Advance before it, while Nintendo is still keeping the 2DS on the market as a companion to the Switch, it's only a matter of time before the handheld truly gets put to rest, the amount of new 3DS games reducing to barely even a trickle, what with the official site as of writing this having the new Shovel Knight expansion as the only unreleased game still going to the 3DS. But don't fret, while the long spectacular journey may finally be over, the DS has left a permanent mark all over the entire gaming industry. Just take the Switch. While it may be a home console in name, the essence of the DS still lives on within it, as I myself use it far more as a handheld than I've ever used it docked. Looking back, the era of the DS and 3DS was really something to behold, being host to all kinds of creativity that could only take place due to Nintendo's decision to change things up. And even though I'm sure the company will continue creating wacky new concepts to enthrall the masses, the Switch being a perfect example of one, the Nintendo DS was truly one of a kind, leading to a movement throughout the handheld market that honestly, I doubt we'll ever see again, at least not in the same fashion. In the end, even though the DS may be dead in name, its spirit will forever live on within the games and consoles that succeed it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, do subscribe. And today's cool thing of the day is the Mario and Luigi series. Having started with Bowser's Inside Story, I've loved this RPG spin-off series for 10 whole years now. In fact, all things considered, I may even make a video about them in the future. But with the company behind them recently going bankrupt and the state of the series up in the air, here's to hoping Nintendo won't just fling it aside. They could still do so much more with it. Though hey, if you've never played a single one, check them out. They're loads of fun. So that being said, I'm the RPG Monger, and don't forget that each and every one of you are fantastic.